the late Trajkovsky, advising him on information society. And it was an interesting time during that time to be involved, because it was the time when the WSIS preparations were on. And actually, this is one of the things that I want to kind of infuse throughout in this conversation, which is the WSIS process, as it was a process of, I would say, among other things, building trust. And if we're talking about internet governance, I want us to start thinking about how it has developed trust over these past, let's say, 20, 25 years. If we had a period when everybody trusted the authority of John Postel or of Bob Kahn or of Windsurf, of these kinds of authorities in the development of the internet, over time this trust had to go into institutions like ICANN. And a big discussion during that time was, well, how does ICANN fit into this, and what does internet governance really mean? And for a very long time there was a very need to define what internet governance means, what governance is, and there was a lot of distrust between the stakeholders involved, because they came from different kind of cultures. Some were diplomats, some were from the technical community, some were from the business community, and everybody was looking at the same thing quite differently. So in starting that off with, Andrea, you come from ICANN, and it is perhaps the most discussed organization throughout the history of what we call internet governance. It's the cornerstone, really, of the internet governance ecosystem, although not the only, and many more are developing. But it remains, and I see that we're colleagues actually from the Fletcher School, so I mean you have international relations background, and I would like to ask you from that prism, in terms of the international system as it is, defined by nation states for a very long time, all of a sudden we have the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. The I is not even international, it's internet. So I mean, and with the IANA transition right now, ICANN is fully kind of, with the exception that it's founded in California and as an NGO, well, not as an NGO, as a corporation incorporated under California law, any other connection to a country has now been almost taken out. So it exists as a standalone organization, very important, and yet out of the international system in a way. Would you like to kind of start, but first tell us a bit about ICANN, but then perhaps like jump that into that.
Thank you. Very interesting question, and congratulations for graduating at Fletcher.
Yeah, you too.
So where do I start? Well, I work for ICANN now. That's my 3rd year, and I'm responsible for stakeholder engagement, and I'm based out of the Brussels office. Before joining ICANN, I was working for the United Nations. I was working for UNESCO. And I was there working very much on the role of internet and communication and ICTs for development. And so we looked at the internet back then as a tool for development, as a tool for helping people and countries to increase their economic power, growth. And back then, the whole discussion around internet governance was very much focused on the digital divide, focused on this new technology that suddenly brought tremendous development for some countries, tremendous development on possibilities for people to connect to each other. And as you said, all of that was based in a almost full trust of this technology. These technologies that brought us back then was Wikipedia or Google, with the possibility to open up a computer or a mobile phone nowadays and reach everyone else in the world, regardless of borders. It was very much infused by a full belief in the amazing side of this very same technology. And for many years, even before I joined ICANN, ICANN was seen as an important organization that probably was doing something that governments should have been doing. And so the problem with trust was there was a trust into the technology. There was a lack of trust in the organization dealing with this technology. So just to be very, very short, ICANN is the global address book of the internet. So the internet doesn't exist by itself. It's not like the beautiful lake next door. It's not a natural resource. The internet is a network of networks. And these network of networks, they look like one single internet because they all use the same common address system. And ICANN, at the very simple, the simplest point, it's the manager of this address book that allows thousands of networks to connect to each other, look like one single network. So that's the work that ICANN does. So as I was saying, there was a trust into the internet, but a lack of trust in this organization for political reasons. When I joined ICANN, this lack of trust into organization wasn't that prominent internally. Until one precise point, actually until one precise day, and we go back into June 2013, when the Snowden revelation came to be. And I think that suddenly the trust into the technology itself, in the internet, started to drop. And even among the technical communities that was working and developing this technology, so the engineers that they are still working and they have position at ICANN, even themselves, they were amazed is to use the soft word, on what was going on the internet, on this technology. So the lack of trust that suddenly dropped on the internet had an impact on ICANN itself, and had an impact also on the communities and the governments, starting with the US government. Do you want to to that?
No. I just want to keep kind of things that we can come back to this.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the elements of trust in one of the stakeholders throughout has been a lack of trust, perhaps, by the technical community and by business, perhaps, in governments. And I think that still kind of exists, although there was a time when things started the stakeholders started getting together, started speaking a similar language. But this lack of trust in states has not translated fully into a lack of trust into perhaps the companies that are having a lot more of the information than the states are having.
Well, if we go back to those days, so that was June 2013, the lack of trust was very much also on those big companies that made the internet as we know it today. So we learned back then that Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, they were sharing their databases to the National Security Agency. In hindsight, looking back, you will see that the trust that they lost back then, it didn't last very much. So they didn't lose many users. But the trust in government, that was more problematic. And that, I have to say that the lack of trust in government is what it finally pushed the US government to say, okay, it's time for us that we let go our control over ICANN that back then was a very formal control, was a control of due process. We can go more in depth if you're interested. But I could see there was a symbolic control, and that will completely disrupt the trust on the internet as a whole. To make an example, back then we had clear threats of countries that would come to the US government, would come to ICANN and say, we don't trust you anymore. We have the proof that you're not doing what we thought nobody would be able to do on the internet, although there was a big lie also on that. So we would basically disconnect from that model of the internet, disconnect from that technology, and have our own internet. So that threat unleashed the process, to me, that brought to the ICANN to become completely independent from the US government, and also saved the face of many internet corporations that saw their business at stake. Because one thing is to have one single network that allow you to have almost 2.5 billion of users and potential customers. And one is to have a world where we go back into 197 countries and probably 197 internets.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. Zdravko, one is the US government, and perhaps the Snowden revelations did really force the US government to kind of go into a given direction in terms of transparency, and given that it was the guardian of the internet for such a long time, the place where it started and started developing. But I think it reverberated into many other, into all countries that are regulating aspects of the internet. So it is very important, I think, for organizations like yours, which are responsible. They get their mandate from the parliament, which gets its mandate from the people, but their mandate is to be independent and to say that within this market, within this country, things will be regulated with the end user in mind. So again, can you kind of enlighten us in terms of the aspects of trust in the internet governance at the national level, and how you also see that manifesting when you look internationally?
Yes, thanks for the question. It is true, those events from 2013 really, should I say, created more attention for the issues of internet governance. So in Croatia we started to follow what is happening much more closer, and we appointed a representative from Croatia in the Governmental Advisory Committee at ICANN. And also we thought of the question how to work on this trust and how to create something on the national level where people could come together and discuss internet governance issues. So in 2014 we established Croatian IGF, which is CDIG at the national level, and we had 3 successful annual meetings so far, one just last week in Zagreb. So I'm saying all this because I'm a member also of the executive committee of the Croatian IGF. But what I would like to say now, I would like to put on my hat as a council member of the Croatian Regulatory Authority for Network Industries, which is a national independent regulator for network industry. So it's not just electronic communications, but it's also post and railways. Because what we do, and this is why this session comes together, it is a good mix. What we do as a regulator, it has huge impact on many issues that affect the end users and how end users are using and living internet today. So I see many topics here on the zero rate, net neutrality, and so on, because it all depends how the national, so classical network regulators would affect, first of all, connectivity. So we need to have all the people connected so that we can talk about other things. Then we can talk about how the traffic that goes through these connections is treated. What do we want to do with that traffic? What do we want to allow and what do we want to prevent? We see now in America something is changing dramatically. It's about net neutrality. But the question is really, do we as regulators want to protect net neutrality? Do we want to protect the right of every user to access and connect to any other endpoint at the internet? And how do we regulate those intermediaries that can, actually they have technical means, that can really control and shape the traffic that goes through their networks? So that's very interesting, and that opens a lot of other questions. And then again, one more thing that goes one layer up is how do we treat so-called OTT players?
Can I jump into that exactly? Because an interesting thing I think happens in here and in other countries that I've seen lately. When people want to discuss sensitive things and whatever they feel is sensitive, more and more people I think are going to OTT services, be they Viber or WhatsApp or whatever it is, because at least they feel that there's some encryption there and in that conversation. Whether that is so or not, it's a different, fully is a different conversation. But I think that what is happening in terms of trust, what would before there will be doubt in such OTT services, all of a sudden what's happened is that the trust has taken out from the telecoms and it's given to some OTT services. Would you agree that that is happening perhaps in Croatia or wider?
Yes, definitely. This is what is happening because whenever new technology comes, whenever something new is invented, at that point in time we do not know how this will affect our lives. But later on, people are very innovative and creative, so these new technologies find their use. So this is exactly one excellent example. So when I get a message from Viber, all your messages and all your conversations encrypted end to end, it sounds pretty good. And I think this is what technology enables us.
It gives us the trust that
Yes.
Well, I'll bring in here Christina if she's online. She's from the European Commission. And we're talking about regulation. I think that many people equate European Commission with regulation. But it does, I would be among those who would say that it does its job well. And it's really an important point in the European architecture, this kind of regulation that the European Commission brings in. So, Christina, if you want to jump in terms of the aspects of trust which organization like the European Commission brings into internet governance issues. Jump in, please.
Yes, hello. First of all, checking whether you can hear me well.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for offering me the opportunity to contribute, even from a distance, and apologies for not being able to be there in person. Yes, I hope you can see my face on the screen. I think that the way you are framing this discussion is really very interesting around the trust and also taking a look at what has happened until now in terms of internet governance, and then we can reflect on what comes next. And I think that we are now at a very important moment to do this reflection. First of all, because we have seen a lot of developments in the last few years, like we were hearing before about the IANA transition. We had a number of major developments in internet governance. But we should also ask ourselves what comes next. What is the system really working? Have we solved the issues that are around trust? And I think that in this particular moment in time, where we see, in general, I would say, a lot of distrust, a lot of fear, and not only in the digital world, but globally. We see, although we have a global world, a globalized world, we see new barriers and new fears coming in. So, in a way, the value of the Internet in eliminating barriers is really important. As you know, you were mentioning in the EU, we are working on regulation, so we are working at modernizing the rules that we have in the context of the digital single market. And we just released our midterm review on the 10th of May, where we basically take stock of what we have done until now with a view to complete the digital single market, and we look at the existing challenges ahead. And maybe, if you want, I can say, yeah.
Christina, like, do you feel that, I mean, both at the national level and at the European level, regulators, legislators have done their job quickly enough to adapt to the new developments? And of course, it's a question that I think that everybody would say no. But if that is the supposition on my side, is the role of courts then the one taking on a legislative function, because courts are interpreting situations that legislatures are not addressing? And do you feel that that is also happening at the European level in general?
Yes, I mean, it seems an easy question to answer, but it's not. So, because you have to think about the EU level, the national level, but also the global level. So if I can briefly start on the global level, and in terms of trust, I think that some steps have been made in terms of the functioning of the global internet governance model, but I also see that the same tensions that we had 20 years ago are still there. So there is a need to do something on that front. On the European level, I see your point that courts are more and more sort of addressing problems that are not solved from the legislative or regulatory point of view. Part of the problem is that you know that regulation takes a long time, but this is also, you know, technology is fast and the pace of regulation is much slower. At the same time, when we manage to do something, like for instance, I'm thinking about net neutrality rules or the NIS directive, the Network on Information Security. So there you had long process, but the added value is that you have really the possibility to involve all stakeholders to consult in a very democratic way, and then you arrive at rules that are fit for purpose. And I'm thinking in particular at the case of the net neutrality rules, where we had a long process, but in the end we were able to enshrine in regulation a very important principle, which is that of the open internet. While also the previous speaker was making reference to the different situation, for instance, in the U.S. Of course, there is need to do much more. Of course, the new developments are increasing in speed, and we have to make sure that we are ready. The European Union is really focusing on that. The digital single market is really a big priority, and a number of initiatives have already been launched. And now I'm talking about, you know, from the Commission perspective, we have launched a number of initiatives. Now the ball is in the hands of the co-legislators. And here, again, I think that the key message should be that we are all in this together. So in order for Europe to make the most of the internet revolution, of the digital revolution, we have to be together in this. And member states, the parliaments, civil society, they have all to work together. And in this sense, I think that the multi-stakeholder model is really the only answer we have. It's not a perfect model. There is indeed, a lot of things that we should look at, but it's the only model that can really be viable.
Thank you very much, Christina. In jumping into this, in the conversation on courts, there was a very recent ruling by a German court regarding toys, Internet of Things. This is an issue that is just rising. Well, it has been rising in a way over the past, let's say, 10 years or so. But right now, it's in front of us. And what we're facing is perhaps something that for tomorrow's session on cybersecurity could be kind of discussed. Are these things that are joining the internet secure, and are companies making enough of an effort to secure them? So in jumping into this, perhaps I'll call on Gergana to tell us her thoughts on IoT. It's as I said, one of my favorite numbers is 3.4 times 10 to the power of 38, which is the number of IPv6 addresses. Many many countries are, some are faster, some are slower into adapting IPv6. But this is one of the essential building blocks of what we call the Internet of Things, where everything around us will be able to some way be connected to the Internet. And whether it is a sensor, whether it is a device. So could you kind of share your thoughts on this IPv6, IoT, and the whole issue of trust around them?
Yes, thank you for the very interesting question, Lupcho. So first of all, I would like to maybe just briefly introduce RIPE-NCC, if that's okay. Andrea already talked about ICANN being the address book of the internet, and we are at the next level. So we received, RIPE-NCC acts as one of the 5 regional internet registries in the world, and we are serving Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Central Asia. So what happens, we get a large blocks of IP addresses from IANA, and then we distribute them, allocate them to our members, which are internet service providers, telecommunication companies, universities, governments, any company that would like to have their own IP address block. and we keep a registry where we keep the records of which company has which address book. And trust is very important in our business, of course. We're in a very lucky position to act as a neutral organization, neutral entity, without any ambitions to influence policy. However, what we do have is a lot of information. So a lot of researchers or companies, organizations come to us for information on the operational runnings of the internet. And the trust in our organization also stems from from the way that we build our policies. So for our service region, we have what is known as the RIPE community. This is an open community, so anybody interested in the running of the internet is free to join this community by joining our RIPE meetings or joining our mailing lists. And we discuss, the RIPE community discusses the policies which RIPE NCC, the organization behind the RIPE community, then follows when, for example, allocating IP addresses. And so the trust in our work comes from the RIPE community. They tell us what to do and how to do it, and we are accountable to this community. So this trust is really important for what we do and our operations. Okay, so you asked me about IoT in specific. Of course, it's a lot of people view it as the future of the internet, and also the new version of the IP address, version 6. Let me first a little bit maybe talk about version 6. So we have already run out of IP addresses version 4, and we are moving on with version 6 deployment. At the moment, about 10% of connections happen over V6, which is not exactly the progress that we were hoping to see after so many years of deployment. And there are certain countries that are doing better than others. For example, I can give Belgium as a very good example with 55%, way above other countries. And it is very curious why this is happening, and of course it is a carrots and sticks a bit. Regulation, of course, helps a lot, but also capacity building and having a community willing to listen, so network operators willing to listen, willing to deploy the new version. So and this of course relates to IoT, because there are simply not enough addresses to give to billions and billions of IoT devices. Well, trust is also very important with the future of IoT, because if the public doesn't have any trust in the IoT devices, it's just not going to develop and work. However, there is we have seen, for example, a bit of a closed loop with the IoT market. So, for example, consumers demand, of course, low prices for these devices, and for certain devices, manufacturers are willing to provide that. So they make, for example, a lot of cost-cutting measures to make the device as cheap as possible. And one of these cost-cutting measures could be decreased security. If, for example, the device doesn't have any critical operation, for example, a smart thermometer on your fridge, or a smart fridge, or devices on which security is not so important. So they make certain compromises that, in their view, might be warranted based on the nature of the device. However, what happens, so basically this is a closed loop market where consumers, and what happens out of this closed and very happy economy is that we as society end up with a lot of devices with somewhat compromised security, and so then these devices become a very easy target, for example, to be recruited in a botnet attack, which happened in October last year with the large-scale DDoS attack on the DIN servers, the Mirai botnet. Maybe you've all heard about it, I'm sure. And so it is very important that we work in the future to create IoT devices which have a certain minimum level of security in order to restore the public trust in these devices, so that market has a future so that we can reap all the benefits we can from IoT. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you very much. I broke my promise, I apologize in the beginning to kind of bring people in more, but the discussion was flowing very well. And first let me just check with the organizers of how are we with time, because we started a bit later. Are we going a little bit, so should we aim for a quarter after or so, or okay? Just so we know where we are with time. And before I bring in Marcus, then I would like to kind of open the floor for anybody interested to kind of jump in. Again, I see you there. Again, with the prism of trust, and perhaps as right after that, I would ask if somebody knows the story of Babel, and if they would like to narrate it, to tell us everything. What is really the story of Babel? What is the metaphor that we're using here to talk about the internet governance? So first, the gentleman in the red shirt over there. A microphone could be delivered over, or just get up and, well, I guess we have online participants, so a microphone, or how does it function? Oh, so I guess you have to come here. Please. And who's ready to tell us the story of Babel after? Anyone? Nice.
You cannot check Wikipedia in the meantime.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Domen. I'm coming from Slovenia, representing the NGO sector. I just have a comment on the whole debate about IoT and development and what it should be done. I think for starters, we should stop letting the marketing department telling the engineering department what it should do. Because right now, the whole IoT is being developed on a whim by marketing, who then bothers the engineering sector to produce a device.
To these concerns.